whisper of a rusted crate. The rusted crate sat quietly in the darkest corner of forgotten barracks basement, untouched for 78 years. It wasn't hidden behind locks or chains. It was hidden behind neglect. Time had simply swallowed it. The wooden beams above sagged with age. The floor was warped and soft from rot, and dust floated like mist in the stale, breathless air. Everything around it had crumbled, except for that one metal box. Nothing about it said, "Open me." And yet, on a foggy morning in November 2022, a young museum assistant, flashlight in hand, brushed away a layer of grime and saw something almost invisible. One word, etched into the metal. Unit 13. He didn't recognize it. No one did. It looked like an ordinary military supply crate. No glowing secrets. No obvious historical value. Just rust and silence. But when they pried it open, what spilled out was not ammunition, but the weight of unspoken history. Inside were 27 letters, one small leather-bound journal, and a sealed envelope, yellowed and brittle. On its face, just one line, "To whom the silence betrayed." The words felt more like a confession than a dedication. Archivists assumed it was a prank, a fabrication. But as they read through the first few pages, it became clear this was no fiction. This was a record of people who weren't supposed to exist. These documents reference a military unit, one that operated behind enemy lines in 1944. But this unit, Unit 13, did not appear in any official record, not in the U.S. Army, not in Allied intelligence, not in internal declassified documents, not even as a redacted entry. It simply didn't exist. But someone forgot to tell the men who wrote those letters, each one written in a different hand, some in neat, almost calligraphic strokes, others in rushed, trembling lines, as if the ink itself were running from something. They weren't addressed to military command or to government agencies. They were written to mothers, wives, sons, sometimes no one, sometimes just silence. Mother, one read, "I know this letter will never reach you, but I need to write it anyway, because here, there is nothing left to hold on to but memory, and even that is starting to blur." Another was colder, sharper. "They sent us here without names, without rank. We are to be shadows. If we're captured, we don't exist. If we die, we'll be erased. And if we survive, we were never here. Who sends men to die and forgets their faces? Who builds a war machine so precise it can operate with ghosts?" Unit 13 had no insignia, no chain of command, no official objectives. Their mission, as pieced together from these letters, was to infiltrate deep into occupied France and sabotage communication, lines critical to the German command. No glory, no backup, no way home. If they were caught, disavowed. If they succeeded, ignored. They were what military historians call zero trace, but they called themselves the forgotten. In a journal belonging to one of the men, name redacted, though he signs the final page, E, there's a chilling entry. "We're 8 men. We speak less each day, not because we're scared, but because there's no one left to hear us. We move at night. We sleep in ruins. We haven't seen our reflections in months." Who were they? A boy who signed his letter, Elier, and spoke of a scarf his mother gave him. A man who wrote in Latin verses, calling himself the priest. A cartographer who continued drawing maps of home. A sniper who stopped naming his targets. None of them expected to return. And perhaps that's why they wrote, not to survive, but to leave something behind. A fingerprint, a whisper, proof of humanity. They weren't heroes by any formal definition. They weren't legends. They weren't even people the world was meant to know. But every letter ends the same way. "I hope not to be forgotten. Even if I have no name, let me leave a mark." History books remember battles, but they rarely remember the men who died in silence, who obeyed orders never to speak, who gave everything and got nothing back but silence. But now, the crate has been opened, and their words have been found. So listen closely. because what follows is a story. It's a resurrection. Elliot Grant's letter. Dear Mother, this letter will never reach you. I know that, but I'm writing it anyway, because here, in this place, I have nothing left but your memory, and even that is slipping. Elliot Grant was 19. He volunteered, not to protect his country, but to run away. From what? Even he wasn't sure. A past too heavy, a silence too loud, or maybe just himself. Before the war, he was no one. No medals, no scars. Just a boy who carried books more than burdens. But now, surrounded by collapsed ruins and flickering ghosts, he clung to a single piece of home, a worn-out scarf his mother had wrapped around his neck the day he left. He wore it under his uniform, even when it was too hot, even when it itched, because it reminded him that someone, somewhere, once looked at him and said, "Come back." But he wasn't coming back, and he knew it. That's why he wrote, at night, by candlelight, sitting on broken stone and shattered walls, his hands trembling not from the cold, but from the weight of unsaid things. I ran, Mama, because when you looked into my eyes, you saw something I couldn't face. You never blamed me, but I couldn't forgive you for seeing the fear in me that I refused to name. Elliot wasn't a soldier. He wore the uniform, carried the rifle, followed the orders, but inside, he was still the boy who used to dream of stargazing with his brother and reading books under the covers at night. In Unit 13, he was the youngest, the quietest, the one who wrote while others tried to sleep, the one who buried his letters in jars beneath the mud, as if they were seeds that might one day grow into remembrance. No one in the unit knew what he wrote. He never read aloud, never shared. His voice rarely rose above a whisper, but on paper, he screamed. One letter reads, "I hear the others snore beside me, and I wonder how they sleep. I can't close my eyes without seeing the boy I shot 2 days ago. He wasn't older than me. I think he was crying, and I think I might have been too." Guilt bloomed like frost in his chest. He tried to pray, but the words felt foreign. He tried to hope, but the sky never changed. Every day blurred into the next. The only difference was how deep the silence had sunk. One night, he wrote something he never intended anyone to see. "I am not brave. I just haven't found a way to stop being here." There was no glory in his words, only fragments of a boy trying to survive a war he didn't believe in, wearing a uniform sewn from fear. But what makes Elliot's letters unforgettable isn't the pain, it's the hope buried beneath every word. If someone ever finds this letter, please don't lie to my mother. Tell her the truth, that I was scared, that I cried, that I wrote because it was the only way I could stay human, and that even though I was a coward, I still believed someone would remember me. He never signed his letters with rank or full name, just Elliot. Simple, small, but human. That night, he placed the letter into an old glass jar, sealed it, and dug it into the dirt beneath the broken chapel wall. Above it, he stacked 3 stones. They're probably still there. No medals, no monument, no grave, just 3 stones, and a boy's final whisper. I was here, and I didn't stay silent. Elliot Grant's voice doesn't echo in history books, but in that letter, it speaks louder than any gunfire ever could. Because sometimes, the most powerful act in war is to remember who you are. Ghost Journal. They called him Ghost. He never told them his real name, and no one asked, because in Unit 13, names didn't matter. Only survival did. Ghost didn't sleep where others slept. He didn't eat when they ate. He walked silently, just outside the edge of the firelight, like a shadow that wasn't supposed to be seen, but was always felt. His face was worn, not from age, but from something deeper. He didn't blink often, didn't flinch, didn't speak, but he wrote, torn paper, charcoal from burnt wood, fingers calloused for more than just cold. His journal was found at the bottom of the crate, wrapped in a bloodstained cloth. No title, no signature, but each page was a quiet scream. I came here to die, but death refuses to take me. The others respected him, feared him, maybe not because he was cruel, but because he had already accepted something they were still running from. Loss, abandonment, the end of identity. Ghost had no rank, no patch, no prayers, but he had grief, and he carried it like a second uniform. Some pages in his journal were full of writing, line after line. A storm of memories spilled across the paper. Others contained only a sentence. One read, "The day I shot the boy in a red scarf, I stopped believing in sides." One night, Elliot Grant approached him. A rare moment, a flicker of curiosity in the quiet. "Why do they call you Ghost?" he asked. Ghost didn't answer. He simply closed his notebook, looked away, and whispered, "Because I used to be someone, but not anymore." The next day, Ghost wrote, "Names are for people who plan to be remembered. I don't." But in the spaces between his sentences, there was still something human, something bruised, not dead, just buried. He wrote about a woman, never named, only described. She used to hum when she cooked, always the same tune. I can't remember the melody, but I remember the warmth. He wrote about the night he left, and how he didn't say goodbye. Because what do you say when you know you won't come back? One page, its ink smeared, its edges torn, read only. "The day I tried to end it, I felt relief, but the gun jammed, and I laughed. I actually laughed." Ghost didn't believe in fate, but he believed in punishment. And in his mind, staying alive was exactly that, a sentence. Serve one silent day at a time. Yet for all his detachment, he never left the others behind. He watched them when they slept, tended to wounds without being asked, replaced firewood, patched boots. He didn't speak, but he never turned away. That was his language. His final journal entry was different, written slower, with purpose. "I know I will not return." That's no longer a tragedy. But if you find this, know that I tried. I tried to stay human, even when everything else was stripped away. The last page had only 5 words. "I was here, still watching." Ghost left no grave, no dog tag, no eulogy, only these pages, only these breaths on paper. But maybe that's enough, because sometimes the quietest man in the room carries the heaviest truth. Sergeant Doyle's night. Sergeant Alan Doyle wasn't born to be a soldier. He was shaped into one, not by choice, not by pride, but by inheritance. His father died in uniform, his uncle, too, and by the time he was 12, he already knew how to fold a flag. He learned early that silence was safer than sorrow, that men don't cry in public, and that medals weighed more on the soul than on the chest. By the time Doyle found himself in Unit 13, he no longer believed in beginnings, only in continuations of pain. He didn't speak about the first time he killed a man. He didn't speak about anything, really, because every word felt like betrayal, to himself, to the men he'd lost, to the version of God he no longer prayed to. But at night, when no one was watching, he folded and unfolded a letter 100 times. It was from Mary, his wife, his anchor, the only voice that still reached him through the static. "I still set a place for you at the table," she wrote. "Sometimes I even serve your coffee, knowing full well it'll get cold. But it helps me remember you as a man, not a memory." Doyle would read that line and press the paper to his chest, not to feel close to her, but to prove to himself that he could still feel. Because most days he wasn't sure. In the mornings, he barked orders, counted supplies, checked weapons. He looked every bit the sergeant they needed, but inside, he was unraveling thread by thread. One day, a young soldier froze during a fire exchange. Doyle pulled him to safety, saved his life. Later that night, the boy came to him, eyes shaking. "I thought I was going to die," he whispered. And Doyle, looking into those wide, terrified eyes, realized he had nothing to offer. No wisdom, no comfort, just silence. So he did the only thing he could. He placed his hand on the boy's shoulder and said, "Me too." That was the truth. He thought he was going to die every day, not from bullets, but from the slow erosion of who he used to be. In his journal, he wrote, "I wear my cross, but it feels more like weight than faith. I used to talk to God. Now I talk to fire. It's warmer, and at least it listens." He missed the scent of bread in the morning, the way Mary would hum tunelessly while sweeping the floor. He missed the sound of rain on the roof, the creak of their wooden stairs, the way she used to say, "Come home safe," like a promise. Neither of them could keep, and yet he stayed here with Unit 13, leading ghosts, holding their broken pieces together, while his own cracked in silence. One evening, after a long day of marching in mud, he watched Ghost quietly stitch a torn sleeve. That image, a man who had lost everything, still mending what he could, shook Doyle to the core, because it reminded him of Mary, sitting by candlelight, patching holes in his old shirts, telling him, "You don't have to be whole to be mine." He felt something wet on his cheek. It startled him. It had been so long since he cried. He had forgotten what it felt like. That night he didn't sleep. He stayed by the fire, watching it shrink, feeling it fade, and wondering if that's what was happening to him too. In his final entry, he didn't write to Mary. He wrote to the boy he used to be. "You were so sure of the world, so eager to do the right thing. You didn't know that sometimes right and wrong bleed into the same color in war. I wish I could protect you, but I became the man who lost a map home." And then a final line, scratched in the corner, small, barely legible. "If God is still watching, I hope he sees me trying." Sergeant Alan Doyle died long before his body ever stopped breathing. But in the quiet moments, when courage looks more like weeping than war cries, his memory lingers. Because some men don't break in battle. They break afterward, when no one is watching. North's map. They called him North. No one knew his real name. He never offered it, not out of secrecy, but because names in this place felt like promises no one could keep. Before the war, he was a teacher. Middle school, geography. He taught kids how to read maps, how to measure distance, how to find their way back when they got lost in the woods. But nothing in his lessons prepared him for a world where there was no path home. His students used to call him Mr. H. He never corrected them. He liked the sound of it, like a man rooted in routine. Chalk dust on his sleeves, coffee on his desk, maps on his walls. Now all of that was gone. In Unit 13, he carried no weapon, only pencils and scraps of paper on which he drew imaginary paths, not to enemy camps, but to his old house, his front porch, his daughter's window. Every night, he redrew the route, and every morning, he folded it away, knowing full well he'd never walk it. One night, by dying firelight, he wrote a letter. "Mia, you're probably starting school soon. I used to imagine walking you to class, telling you to be brave, to raise your hand when you knew the answer. But I won't be there, and I'm sorry." He paused, the paper blurred. "Tell your teacher your father was a map maker. Tell her he helped people find their way. Don't tell her he forgot his own." North wasn't the kind to break down, but silence is a cruel teacher, and he'd had more than enough lessons. Sometimes, when the unit was on the move, he would mutter directions under his breath, not for navigation, but out of habit, out of the need to pretend. There was still such a thing as direction. 2 clicks north. Veer west by the split oak. Cross the stream. You're almost home. Only there was no oak, no stream, no home. One evening, while others were asleep, North sat alone, knees to his chest, studying one of his maps. It wasn't strategic. It was emotional. Each road a memory. Each turn a hope. Ghost walked past and paused. They didn't speak, but Ghost reached into his pocket, took out a folded page from his own journal, and handed it to him. North opened it. One line: "If you ever find the road, walk it for both of us." He nodded, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled, not because he believed, but because someone else still believed in him. The next day, he drew a final map, not of roads or rivers, but of faces. Every man in Unit 13, their placement in camp, their expressions, their names, real or imagined. He titled it, "The Last Known Coordinates of Humanity." And below that he wrote, "If anyone finds this, please know we weren't just soldiers. We were fathers, teachers, sinners, believers. We were lost, but we found each other." North's map was folded and placed in the crate. No signature, no return address, just that final thought. We didn't find the way home, but for a while, we remembered what it felt like to belong somewhere. The Whispering Priest. They called him Father once, back when his collar still meant something, back when he believed a man in black could carry light. Now they called him the Whispering Priest, not because he preached, but because at night, when everyone else slept, you could see his lips moving. No sound, just the faint rhythm of a man trying to remember how to speak to a God who no longer answered. He never told anyone his real name. Maybe he'd forgotten it. Maybe he thought saying it out loud would tether him to a life he no longer felt worthy of claiming. He was once the caretaker of a small chapel on a hill, white-walled, wooden benches, a bell that rang twice every Sunday. He used to welcome the broken and the lonely, place a hand on their shoulder, and say, "You are not alone here." Now he was alone, so utterly alone. And every time he opened his mouth to pray, his voice caught in his throat like a sob that had nowhere left to go. His Bible, once worn from love, was now weathered by guilt, the pages warped from rain, from blood, from hands that trembled too much to hold on to anything sacred. He didn't carry it in his pack anymore. He folded a single page, tucked it inside the lining of his coat, and pressed it to his chest when no one was watching. Some nights, the other soldiers saw him crouched in the mud, facing the horizon, murmuring into nothing. They thought he was praying, but he wasn't praying. Not anymore. He was asking, "Are you still there? Or did you leave the battlefield like the rest of us wanted to?" In his journal, stitched together with string and scraps of paper, his words were not sermons. They were elegies. "I have seen men kill in your name, and die with your name still fresh on their lips. I have held boys who begged me to bless them, as they bled out from holes no blessing could close. I have whispered the Lord's Prayer over corpses already cold, and I have waited for a sign, for silence to crack, for meaning to return, but it hasn't, and I am still here, back in the chapel." He used to speak of grace like it was a river, a current that could carry even the worst of men home. But now in these ruins, all rivers led to mud, and the only current he felt was a slow, unrelenting pull of despair. He hadn't confessed in months, because he no longer knew what was sin and what was survival. If I lie to keep them calm, is that mercy or manipulation? If I smile when I no longer believe, is that faith or performance? If I whisper a blessing over a body I no longer believe will find peace, am I comforting the dead or just fooling the living? No one asked him these questions, but he asked them of himself, again and again, until the repetition became a kind of liturgy. And yet, he never left, never withdrew, never stopped showing up when someone needed a hand to hold. He cleaned the wounds no one else wanted to see. He sat with the ones who couldn't sleep. He offered what little warmth he had. Even when his own bones begged for fire, he didn't lead with answers. He led with presence. Because sometimes, being there is the only prayer that still matters. One night, after a particularly brutal march, Ghost approached him. Neither man spoke for a while. Then Ghost asked, his voice barely audible, "Do you still believe?" The priest closed his eyes, took a long breath, and answered without hesitation, "I don't know, but I still miss him. That night," he wrote, "I miss God, like a child misses a father who left too soon, like a widow stares at an empty chair. I miss the feeling of being watched over, of believing someone else could carry the weight. I miss believing that suffering meant something." One morning, before sunrise, Elier found the priest standing barefoot in the frost, hands outstretched, eyes closed. "What are you doing?" Elier asked. The priest opened his eyes slowly. His breath was white in the cold. He whispered, trying to feel forgiven. In his final journal entry, written in faint, crooked letters, he offered no benediction, no salvation, only this: "If anyone finds this, I ask you not to pray for me. Instead, stand beside someone in silence. Hold their fear without trying to fix it. And if you must whisper anything, whisper. You matter, even in the dark." There is no record of how the priest died, only that his coat was found draped gently over stone, and beneath it, a folded Bible page, stained with tears. We don't know if he ever found peace, but we do know he gave it. And sometimes, that's all a man of God can do. Elias's testimony, the civilian who drew death, he never wore a uniform, never fired a weapon, never stormed a trench. And yet, Elias believed he had more blood on his hands than most of the soldiers in Unit 13, because Elias was a map maker, a civilian engineer, brought in not to fight, but to calculate. He drew the lines. He chose the targets. He was the man behind the curtain, marking excess where bombs would fall, where buildings would turn to dust, where people would disappear. And for a while, he convinced himself that numbers were cleaner than bullets. That war, when seen from above, was just a game of angles and arcs, ranges and radii. "I'm not a killer," he told himself. "I just design trajectories." But one day, he received a box, delivered by a quiet, nervous courier. Inside was a folded child's drawing, crayon, a house, a sun, 2 stick figures holding hands. On the back, a note: "This is where you dropped it." No name, no address, just that. And it shattered something in Elias that he never managed to repair. From that moment on, he started keeping a journal, not of orders or formulas, but of the faces he imagined, the ones beneath the coordinates. "Grid 9B, he wrote. "Likely a school. If there was a bell, it doesn't ring anymore. Sector 22, bakery. You could smell it from 2 streets away, I bet. Target 3C, rooftop laundry line still full. Someone expected to come home." The army called him a genius. Surgical, precise. But Elias felt like a surgeon operating without anesthesia. He saw the body flinch. He heard the screams. Even if no one else did, he requested to be transferred to the field. They laughed. "You're more useful behind the lines, Elias. You're winning this war with your brain." He didn't want to win. He wanted to feel, to bleed, to suffer like the rest. Because guilt, when left unpunished, festers into self-hatred. He began sitting alone, away from the others, head in his hands, mumbling apologies to people he would never meet. One night, he approached the priest. They sat in silence for a long time. Then Elias whispered, "Do you think God forgives people who never pulled the trigger, but still got people killed?" The priest didn't answer. He just placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. And for the first time in months, Elias wept, the kind of weeping that shakes the ribs and leaves the lungs empty. "I remember names of the streets I erased," he said, "but not the people who lived on them." In his journal, he began to draw again, but not maps, faces, smiles, mothers with children, old men on balconies, young lovers beneath street lamps, each face a monument to someone he would never meet, but would never forget. One entry stood alone on a torn page. I used to measure angles. Now I measure absence. Elias eventually stopped eating, not out of protest, but because the hunger inside him was no longer physical. Ghost once found him sitting alone, hands trembling, murmuring equations to himself. If one bomb erases 20 lives, and I've signed off on 92 strikes, then I am what exactly? He wasn't asking for pity. He was asking for a name, a label, something that would make sense of the weight he carried. He didn't die in battle. He simply stopped being. One morning, he didn't get up. No blood, no wounds, just a man, folded into himself, like paper in the shape of question. They found his final journal entry, pinned to the wall of the tent. I was never a soldier, but I stood behind them, drew their shadows, fed the machine. I am sorry for the lines I drew, for the lives I reduced to dots, for the silence I mistook for safety. If I am to be remembered, let it be not for the maps I made, but for the lives I learned to mourn. This is my testimony. I was there, and I saw, and I broke. Elias wasn't buried with honors, but Ghost built him a small cairn, each stone etched with the name of a place Elias had once marked, a quiet apology from one ghost to another, because some wars are fought with guns, and some with guilt. Ghost's final letter, the one who survived too long. They call me Ghost because I disappeared when the shooting started. But the truth is, I never disappeared. I stayed. I watched. I remembered. And maybe that's worse. Everyone else got an ending. A scream. A whisper. A final breath into someone else's hands. But me? I just kept going. I kept breathing long after the lungs beside me had collapsed. Kept walking long after our footprints had been swallowed by mud. Kept seeing their faces. Again and again. In every shadow. They say survival is a gift, but no one talks about how heavy it is. No one says that staying alive sometimes feels like stealing air from the ones who deserved it more. I wasn't the bravest. I wasn't the smartest. I wasn't even the kindest, but I was the last. And I don't know if that makes me lucky or cursed. The day the final letter was written, my hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the pen. I had nothing left but silence and scars. I wandered from the woods for 3 days with no sense of direction, no orders, no hope. I passed fields where we once slept side by side, tunnels where we whispered plans with our backs to the cold, ruins where someone laughed once. I think it was North. He had a way of finding humor in ashes. There were 8 of us. I remember all their names, not the code names, the real ones. The ones we stopped using, so we could become invisible. But I remember Elier's nervous tapping. He'd tap his boot twice before every mission, like a prayer. I remember the way the priest held Elias's shoulder the night he thought he couldn't go on. And I remember Echo's voice, cracking in the cold as he sang to calm us all down. They're all still here, not in body, but in memory. They cling to me like frost. Sometimes, I hear them whisper in the wind. Ghost, tell them we were real. I've tried. God knows I've tried. But history is written by the ones who come home wearing medals, not by the ones who come home with nothing but nightmares. I've sent letters to officials. No reply. I've spoken to journalists. They smile politely, then change the subject. I've screamed into the void, but the void doesn't echo. I went to the old chapel once, the one Father used to talk about. It was crumbling, abandoned, but I lit a candle anyway. It flickered for exactly 13 minutes. I counted, 1 for each heartbeat I wish I could return. And now I'm tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep can fix, the kind that lives in your bones, the kind that whispers every morning. Why are you still here? Maybe this is why I've stayed. Maybe my job was to carry the flame long enough to pass it to someone who still believes light matters. If you're reading this, if you're holding this letter, you are that someone. Please, Say their names. Say them out loud. Let their voices rise one more time, not as ghosts, but as people who mattered, people who felt pain and joy, who dreamed of gardens and held photos of loved ones in trembling hands. They weren't machines. They weren't disposable. They weren't fiction. They were mine, and I miss them in every sunrise. Before I go, let me give you something, a truth. There are wars we fight with guns, and wars we fight in our heads long after the battlefield is gone. I survived the first. I'm still fighting the second. But maybe, just maybe, if someone hears this, the battle can end, not with a bullet, but with memory. I am Ghost, and I remember. This is my final letter. I will bury it in the crate where the others rest, and with it I'll bury myself, not in earth, but in silence, because sometimes the most loyal thing you can do is to finally let go